The September evening had settled over Little Pensford like a gentle benediction, drawing the village into that golden hour when harsh daylight softens into something altogether more forgiving. The annual Harvest Festival had transformed the village green into a tableau of rural contentment. Paper lanterns swayed between the ancient elms, casting dancing shadows across tables laden with the fruits of local industry, jam tarts that gleamed like amber jewels, seed cakes of impressive solidity, and cut-glass bowls of lemonade attended by ladies whose sharp eyes ensured that propriety was observed even in matters of refreshment distribution. Miss Jane Marple occupied her customary position at such gatherings, slightly removed from the main festivities but with an unobstructed view of the social choreography unfolding before her. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, though her needles remained idle as she observed the evening's proceedings with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that human nature reveals itself most clearly when people believe themselves unobserved. She had arrived that afternoon from St. Mary Mead with a contribution of preserves for the church stall, and now found herself, as always seemed to happen, appointed as the unofficial chronicler of village life. The evening's most intriguing figure was undoubtedly Mrs. Vivian Northcote, who had taken Pear Tree Cottage some 3 months prior. A widow of perhaps 50, she possessed that particular quality of self-possession that marked her as someone accustomed to being noticed, though whether by design or circumstance remained unclear. Tonight she wore black silk that had been skillfully altered to flatter her still elegant figure, and jet beads that caught the lantern light like captured starlight. Her dark hair was arranged in a style that spoke of careful attention without vanity, and her manner suggested a woman who had learned to navigate social waters with practiced grace. "She's been rather solitary since her arrival," murmured Mrs. Bell, the vicar's wife, settling beside Miss Marple with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing important intelligence. "Widow of a naval officer, I'm told. Lost him in Malta. Some sort of fever. She keeps to herself mostly, though she's always perfectly pleasant when one encounters her in the village." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes tracking Mrs. Northcote's movements across the green. The woman moved with a dancer's awareness of space and rhythm, and there was something in her bearing that suggested she was performing even in casual conversation. Not from vanity, but from some deeper necessity. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, stood near the refreshment table in conversation with Colonel Brent, though Miss Marple noticed how his attention kept drifting toward Mrs. Northcote. The good doctor had that particular expression of professional concern mixed with personal interest that she had observed in medical men when confronted with cases that intrigued them beyond their clinical duties. Young Timothy Forsyth, the new curate, seemed equally fascinated by the mysterious widow, though his attention appeared more spiritual than medical in nature. Miss Marple watched as he approached Mrs. Northcote with the earnest manner of someone offering pastoral care, only to find himself drawn into what appeared to be a surprisingly animated conversation about music and dancing. Miss Kitty Dorr, the village seamstress, provided running commentary from her position near the cake stall. "Mark my words, there's more to that woman than meets the eye. I've seen her walking the lanes at all hours, sometimes past midnight, and always alone, always in that same black dress. It's not natural, a woman her age wandering about after dark." As the evening progressed toward its natural conclusion, the village band, consisting of Mr. Pemberton on accordion and young Sally Mitchell with her violin, began their final set. The dancers had gradually thinned out, leaving only the most dedicated couples still moving to the gentle 3/4 time of a traditional waltz. It was then that Mrs. Northcote made her extraordinary gesture. Without partner or invitation, she stepped into the center of the makeshift dance floor as the musicians launched into the Blue Danube. Her movements were precise and hauntingly beautiful, arms raised as though embracing an invisible partner, her body swaying with the practiced grace of someone who had once danced in far grander ballrooms than a village green. The assembled company fell silent, some watching with polite fascination, others with barely concealed discomfort at this breach of social convention. Miss Marple observed the performance with particular interest, noting not just the technical skill of the dancing, but the quality of desperate longing that seemed to drive it. This was not mere nostalgia for happier times, but something far more immediate and urgent, as though Mrs. Northcott were trying to summon someone back from the realm of memory into the present moment. The waltz concluded, and Mrs. Northcott opened her eyes to find herself the center of unwanted attention. For just a moment, her composure wavered, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something raw and frightened in her expression before the social mask slipped back into place. "How lovely music is," Mrs. Northcott said with forced brightness, smoothing her skirts. "It has such power to transport us, doesn't it?" She moved gracefully toward the edge of the green, heading in the direction of the ancient yew arch that led to the churchyard path and the lane beyond. The evening wound down with the usual pleasant confusion of departure. Lanterns being extinguished, chairs folded, the last of the refreshments distributed among the helpers. It was young Timothy Finch, the baker's son, who made the terrible discovery as he gathered stray glasses near the yew arch. His cry shattered the gentle murmur of departing villagers. "Oh, God! Someone come quickly!" Miss Marple was among the first to reach the scene, her small figure moving with surprising swiftness through the crowd. There, just beyond the yew arch, where the path curved toward Pear Tree Cottage, lay Mrs. Northcott. Her black silk dress spread around her like dark water, and her jet beads had scattered across the gravel path like fallen stars. She lay at an impossible angle, her neck clearly broken, her eyes staring sightlessly at the indifferent moon above. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his professional training taking precedence over shock. After a moment, he looked up at the assembled villagers with grave finality. "She's dead. Has been for some time, I should think." Miss Marple stood quietly at the edge of the tragic scene, her sharp eyes noting details that others might overlook in their distress. Mrs. Northcott's evening gloves lay nearby, one showing a dark stain at the cuff. Her shoes, practical black leather with broader heels than fashion demanded, suggested someone who had been prepared for more than a gentle stroll. Most intriguingly, the hem of her dress bore traces of yew needles and crushed leaves, as though she had brushed against the ancient tree in some struggle. "Fetch Sergeant Reed," Colonel Brent commanded, his military training asserting itself in the face of crisis. "This is no place for civilians now." As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, leaving only the necessary few to guard the scene, Miss Marple found herself thinking about widows and the various ways they chose to honor their dead. But somehow she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Northcott's midnight waltz had been less about remembering the past than about confronting something or someone very much alive in the present. The peaceful village of Little Pensford had been irrevocably changed by the sight of a woman who had danced alone with ghosts now lying still beneath the ancient yews. And Miss Marple, with her lifetime of observing human nature in all its complexity, suspected that this was only the beginning of a mystery that would reveal far more about the living than the dead. The September night had grown cold by the time Sergeant Reed arrived from the market town, his bicycle lamp cutting through the darkness as he wheeled up to the yew arch, where a small knot of villagers still lingered despite the late hour. Reed was a methodical man in his 40s, possessed of that particular combination of country practicality and official authority that served him well in a district where most crimes involved straying livestock or Saturday night disagreements at the public house. Tonight, however, presented him with something altogether more serious. Dr. Haydock rose from beside the still form of Mrs. Northcott, brushing dirt from his knees with the careful precision of a man maintaining professional composure in the face of tragedy. "I'm afraid there's no question about it, Reed," he said, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome certainty. "The poor woman is quite dead. Her neck is broken, though whether from a fall or—" He paused, glancing at the assembled faces. Well, that will require a more thorough examination. Reed nodded and began his methodical survey of the scene, his torch beam moving systematically across the narrow path. The yew arch created a natural bottleneck between the village green and the lane leading to the cottages beyond, its ancient roots creating treacherous footing even in daylight. Miss Marple watched quietly as he noted the position of the body, the scattered jet beads that caught his light like fallen stars, and the curious way Mrs. Northcott's evening gloves lay just beyond her outstretched hand. "Now then," Reed said, producing his notebook with the air of a man settling down to serious business. "I'll need to speak with anyone who saw Mrs. Northcott after she left the dancing area. Colonel Brent, you mentioned something about a cyclist." The colonel straightened, his military bearing asserting itself in the face of official inquiry. "Quite right, Sergeant. Tall fellow with a cloth cap, standing by the refreshment table just as Mrs. Northcott finished her performance. Had a bicycle with him, which struck me as odd given the hour." Reed's torch beam found the soft earth beneath the yew, where the unmistakable impression of a bicycle tire pressed into the damp soil. "Interesting," he murmured, crouching to examine the mark more closely. "Fresh, by the look of it. The path's narrow here. He'd have had to wheel it through rather than ride." Miss Marple found herself studying the pattern of evidence with growing interest. The bicycle mark suggested someone had indeed followed Mrs. Northcott, but the positioning of her gloves, one showing what appeared to be a dark stain at the cuff, told a different story than a simple fall. She had observed enough domestic accidents in her long life to know that people who stumble and fall rarely remove their gloves in the process. Young Timothy Forsyth stepped forward, his face pale in the lamplight. "I spoke with her briefly after the dancing, Sergeant. She seemed, well, rather agitated, if I may say so. Not distressed exactly, but as though she were expecting something. When I offered to walk her home, she declined quite firmly, said the night air would do her good." "What time would that have been?" Reed asked, his pencil poised. "Just past 10:20, I should think. The band had finished their final set, and most of the families with children were beginning to gather their things." Reed made careful notes, then turned his attention to the scattered beads. Unlike the neat circle they would have formed around Mrs. Northcott's neck, they lay in an irregular pattern, with several flung some distance down the path, as though the string had been pulled from behind, rather than simply broken in a fall. By morning, the news had spread through Little Pensford with the peculiar velocity that tragedy achieves in small communities. Miss Marple, who had accepted Mrs. Bell's invitation to stay the night at the vicarage rather than attempt the late journey back to St. Mary Mead, found herself at the center of the village's awakening horror as she helped arrange flowers for the morning service. The first callers arrived before breakfast was properly cleared away. Miss Kitty Dorr appeared at the vicarage door with her sewing basket and an expression of grim satisfaction, as though her long-held suspicions about Mrs. Northcott had finally been vindicated. "I always said there was something not quite right about her midnight wanderings," she declared, settling herself at the kitchen table with the air of someone prepared for a lengthy discussion. "A woman doesn't walk the lanes alone at all hours unless she has secrets to hide." Mrs. Bell, pouring tea with the mechanical precision of shock, murmured her agreement. "Such a dreadful thing to happen here. One simply can't imagine. Though I must say, she did keep very much to herself. No callers to speak of except for that woman from town last month. Quite smartly dressed she was, though they seemed to be having rather an intense conversation." Dr. Haydock's arrival interrupted their speculation. The good doctor looked as though he had slept little, his usually ruddy complexion pale with fatigue and something approaching distress. "I've completed my preliminary examination," he announced without preamble. "I'm afraid there's no question of accident. The poor woman was strangled before her neck was broken, then positioned beneath the yew to suggest a fall." The words fell into the kitchen like stones dropped into still water, creating expanding circles of implication. Murder, then, not misadventure. Miss Marple set down her teacup with steady hands, though her mind was already racing through the possibilities this revelation created. Strangled. Mrs. Bell's voice carried the particular horror of someone whose faith in human goodness had just received a severe blow. But who could have done such a thing, and why? Dr. Haydick shook his head grimly. That's beyond my expertise, I'm afraid, though I will say this, whoever did it knew what they were about. The positioning of the body, the attempt to make it appear accidental. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion. The morning brought a steady stream of visitors, each carrying their own theory about the tragedy. Colonel Brent arrived with news from Sergeant Reed's investigation of Pear Tree Cottage, reporting that the dwelling had been found neat as a pin, but precious little in the way of personal effects. No letters, no photographs, hardly anything to suggest where she came from or why she settled here. Miss Marple found this detail particularly intriguing. In her experience, people carried their histories with them in small, telling ways. A photograph on the mantelpiece, letters tied with ribbon, the accumulated detritus of a life lived. Mrs. Northcott's cottage suggested either a deliberate purging of the past or someone who had arrived in Little Pensford with the intention of starting entirely fresh. It was just past noon when the most significant development occurred. A gentleman in a motor car arrived at the village asking directions to the police station with the urgency of someone bearing important news. Leonard Price proved to be a solicitor from the market town, a man of middle years whose professional composure was clearly strained by the morning's revelations. I had an appointment with Mrs. Northcott this very morning, he told Sergeant Reed in the small committee room behind the church, where the official investigation had established its temporary headquarters. She had written requesting my services in drawing up a new will. The matter was, she indicated, rather urgent. Reed leaned forward with interest. A new will, you say? Had she mentioned the nature of her estate? Mr. Price shifted uncomfortably in his chair. She was rather mysterious about the details, Sergeant, but she did indicate that the sum involved was considerable. She wished to ensure that certain parties would be excluded from any inheritance and that others would benefit substantially. She seemed quite determined about it, almost as though she was settling old scores. Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain for her local knowledge, found herself considering the implications of this revelation. A woman with a considerable estate, living quietly in a cottage and keeping to herself, suddenly deciding to alter her will, it suggested either a reconciliation or a final break with her past. Either scenario provided ample motive for murder, particularly if someone stood to lose a significant inheritance. Did she mention any names? Reed asked. Either those to be excluded or those to benefit? She was to bring the details with her this morning, Mr. Price replied. Said she had certain documents that would make everything clear. Legal papers, she called them, though she wouldn't elaborate over the telephone. Reed made careful notes, then looked up with the expression of a man seeing new possibilities. We found no such documents at her cottage, Mr. Price. Either she hadn't prepared them yet, or someone else has them now, Miss Marple said quietly, her pale blue eyes thoughtful, which would suggest that robbery might indeed have been a motive, though not the sort of robbery the village has been imagining. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as the various threads of investigation began to weave together in Miss Marple's mind. A mysterious widow with a substantial estate, living in deliberate anonymity, planning to alter her will in ways that would exclude certain parties, and then murdered on the very eve of that appointment. The bicycle tracks beneath the yew suggested someone had followed her, waited for her, perhaps even arranged to meet her there. But the careful positioning of the body spoke to someone with intimate knowledge of village life, someone who understood that a fall beneath the treacherous yew arch would surprise no one. As the official investigation continued its methodical course, Miss Marple found herself thinking not of the obvious suspects, mysterious cyclists and unknown enemies from Mrs. Northcott's past, but of the curious intensity she had observed in the widow's final waltz. That desperate, almost defiant performance had been more than mere nostalgia. It had been a message, perhaps even a challenge, and someone in Little Pensford had understood that message well enough to respond to it with murder. The peaceful village was learning, as villages do, that the most dangerous secrets are often hidden behind the most ordinary facades, and that sometimes the dead take their most important truths with them into the silence of the grave. The afternoon following Mr. Price's revelation found Sergeant Reed organizing a methodical search of Pear Tree Cottage, with Miss Marple and Mrs. Bell accompanying him under the pretext of pastoral duties. The cottage, when they entered through its modest front door, presented an almost theatrical tidiness that immediately struck Miss Marple as significant. In her long experience of village life, she had learned that people's homes revealed their secrets through small inconsistencies, and Mrs. Northcott's dwelling fairly hummed with deliberate concealment. The sitting room contained the usual furniture one might expect, but with a curious absence of personal touches. No photographs adorned the mantelpiece, only a small alabaster figure of a dancer that seemed to echo the previous evening's tragic performance. The writing desk held a blotter too pristine for regular use and a fountain pen half filled with blue-black ink, suggesting recent correspondence. Most tellingly, 2 teacups sat dried and inverted on a striped cloth, but Miss Marple noticed the faint ring where one cup had recently rested on a different saucer. The proper saucer bore a crack mended with resin, while its substitute did not. Mrs. Bell, careful not to disturb anything, remarked on the needlework basket by the window. Inside, Miss Marple observed black silk remnants, a packet of hooks and eyes, and a card of jet buttons with 2 missing. The black gown had been recently altered, then, which explained the uneven stitching she noticed on a grey serge skirt hanging nearby. The hem had been let down and re-sewn with hasty, irregular stitches, quite unlike the precise work one would expect from Miss Kitty Dawes' professional hand. Sergeant Reed, meanwhile, was pursuing the bicycle evidence with characteristic thoroughness. Harold Sims from the garage had admitted to being near the yew arch the previous evening, claiming he had come to collect a spare tube for Mr. Pemberton. His account of backing away from a bit of a crush near the narrow path aligned with the bicycle tracks found in the soft earth. Reed noted the telltale oil crescent on Sims's right handlebar, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of the dark stain on Mrs. Northcott's glove cuff, perhaps the mark of a hand instinctively raised to ward off a bicycle wheel. The investigation took a more personal turn when they encountered old Mrs. Henderson, whose cottage stood within earshot of Pear Tree Cottage. Despite her advanced years, her hearing remained remarkably acute, and she reported hearing an argument 2 nights before the murder. A man's voice, raised in anger, she insisted, and hers trying to calm him down. Local speech, I'd say, though I couldn't put a name to it. This testimony suggested that Mrs. Northcott's killer was indeed someone from the village, someone who had reason to be concerned about her presence or intentions. Young Timothy Forsyth provided another crucial piece of information when he approached them near the village green. Mrs. Northcott had shown particular interest in local families with naval connections, specifically asking about anyone who had served in the Mediterranean during the war. When Timothy mentioned Colonel Brent's nephew and Dr. Haydock's naval surgery service, she had become notably attentive. This revelation cast Mrs. Northcott's arrival in Little Pensford in an entirely new light, not as a random choice of retirement location, but as a deliberate investigation into specific individuals. The crime scene itself continued to yield disturbing details under closer examination. The scattered jet beads formed an irregular pattern, suggesting the necklace had been pulled from behind rather than simply broken in a fall. The dark stain on her glove remained mysterious, not earth, not blood, but something with a peculiar sheen that caught the light. Most significantly, the crushed yew needles on her dress hem suggested she had been pressed against the ancient tree during whatever struggle had preceded her death. Dr. Haydock's revised assessment painted an even grimmer picture. The strangulation had occurred first, followed by the deliberate breaking of the neck and careful positioning of the body to suggest an accidental fall. This level of calculation spoke to someone intimately familiar with village life, someone who understood how to make murder appear as misadventure beneath the treacherous yew arch. As evening approached, the village psychology began to reveal itself in predictable patterns. The initial shock was giving way to a desperate need to assign blame to outsiders, mysterious strangers, and dangerous vagabonds who could safely be imagined as the source of evil. Miss Kitty Dorr held court at the post office, spinning elaborate theories about Mrs. Northcott's hidden past, while others whispered about the wisdom of accepting strangers into their peaceful community. Yet Miss Marple observed these reactions with the understanding that the most dangerous killers were rarely strangers at all. The careful staging of the crime, the intimate knowledge of village routines required to plan such a deception, and the local accent Mrs. Henderson had detected in the argument all pointed toward someone who smiled and nodded in daily encounters while harboring secrets dark enough to kill for. The September dusk was settling over Little Pensford as Miss Marple made her way back to the vicarage, her mind working through the emerging pattern. A woman with a substantial estate, living under careful anonymity, seeking information about naval connections while planning to alter her will in ways that would exclude certain parties. The picture was becoming clearer, though the final revelation remained tantalizingly out of reach. The peaceful facade of village life had been permanently altered by the understanding that evil could wear familiar faces, and that somewhere among their neighbors walked someone whose past was worth killing to protect. The morning brought Inspector Morrison from county headquarters, his arrival signaling that the investigation had acquired a gravity beyond village boundaries. A lean man with prematurely grey hair and the methodical bearing of someone accustomed to complex cases, he carried with him revelations that would transform their understanding of Mrs. Northcott entirely. Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain for her local knowledge, watched quietly as Morrison spread documents across the vicarage table. The first revelation struck like lightning. Mrs. Vivian Northcott was not who she claimed to be. Her true identity was Mrs. Vivian Hartwell, widow of Commander James Hartwell, who had been court-martialed and cashiered from the Royal Navy 15 years earlier for theft of naval funds intended for Mediterranean port provisions. The scandal had been deliberately hushed to protect the service's reputation, but Commander Hartwell had died in disgrace in a Portsmouth boarding house, leaving his wife to face both social ostracism and financial ruin. This explained the careful anonymity of her cottage, the absence of personal effects, and, most significantly, her pointed inquiries about local naval connections. Morrison's second revelation came from Mrs. Hartwell's London bank, where she had maintained a safety deposit box under her maiden name. The contents painted a picture of methodical investigation spanning months. Careful copies of naval records, correspondence with former officers, and detailed accounts of her husband's final months revealed a woman consumed by the need to clear his name and expose those she believed responsible for his disgrace. The portfolio contained specific references to Little Pensford residents that sent chills through the assembled company. Dr. Haydock had served as naval surgeon in the Mediterranean with particular responsibility for medical supplies procurement during the relevant period. Harold Sims had been a petty officer in the Stores Division who gave crucial testimony against Commander Hartwell. Most damaging of all, Lieutenant Geoffrey Brent, Colonel Brent's nephew, had been the investigating officer who built the case against Hartwell. Mrs. Bell's teacup rattled against its saucer as these connections emerged. Surely you cannot suggest that our neighbors, these are respectable people who have lived here peacefully for years. Morrison's expression remained professionally neutral, though Miss Marple detected grimness beneath his composed manner. Mrs. Hartwell had accumulated evidence suggesting her husband was made a scapegoat for systematic theft of naval supplies. Her correspondence indicates she believed she had identified the real culprits and intended to present her evidence to the Admiralty after securing her will. The missing documents from her cottage suddenly acquired crucial importance. Someone had discovered her investigation and acted to prevent its completion, but the killer remained unaware of the safety deposit box and its damning contents. The careful staging of her death as accident now appeared as desperate attempt to avoid the scrutiny murder inevitably brings. Sergeant Reed looked troubled as he absorbed these implications. If this is accurate, Inspector, we're examining someone with compelling motive indeed. Professional disgrace, loss of pension rights, complete social ruin. Miss Marple found herself reconsidering the argument Mrs. Henderson had overheard 2 nights before the murder. Local accent raised in anger, being reasoned with by Mrs. Hartwell. The pattern suggested someone who had discovered her investigation and attempted dissuasion, resorting to violence when persuasion failed. The investigation now required delicate handling of 3 prominent villagers, each possessing compelling reasons to silence Mrs. Hartwell's revelations forever. Dr. Haydock's medical knowledge equipped him to strangle efficiently and break necks with surgical precision. Harold Sims possessed physical strength and mechanical knowledge to stage the scene convincingly. Through his nephew, Colonel Brent had intimate knowledge of the original investigation and strongest motive to prevent its reopening. Morrison announced his intention to interview each suspect separately, beginning with their whereabouts during the crucial period between Mrs. Hartwell's departure from the village green and discovery of her body. Miss Marple requested permission to observe, citing local knowledge and villagers' trust in her presence. Morrison agreed, recognizing her insight's value. The first interview with Dr. Haydock took place in his surgery waiting room. The doctor appeared composed but tired, readily admitting naval service and acknowledging having met Commander Hartwell during supply procurement investigations. His evening account seemed straightforward, remaining at the festival until 10:30, helping clear medical supplies, then walking directly home via Main Road, avoiding the narrow path where the body was discovered. Yet Miss Marple noticed troubling inconsistencies. When asked about specific memories of Commander Hartwell, Dr. Haydock became notably guarded, claiming little recollection of court-martial details and describing it as unfortunate business, reflecting poorly on everyone involved. His hands showed traces of recently scrubbed staining around fingernails, not unusual for medical men, but curious given his claim of treating no patients that evening. Most telling was his unconscious reaction when Morrison mentioned the stained glove found near the body. Dr. Haydock's thumb rubbed his own cuff edge, the gesture of someone reminded of polishing wood or cleaning instruments. Miss Marple filed this detail away, with growing certainty that the truth lay closer to home than anyone wished to acknowledge. The interview concluded with Dr. Haydock's firm denial of contact with Mrs. Hartwell beyond polite social encounters. Morrison thanked him courteously, but skepticism marked his manner as they prepared for the next interview. Miss Marple found herself considering not merely evidence of guilt, but psychology of someone driven to murder by exposure's fear. 15 years provided ample time for guilt to fester into desperation when threatened with revelation, and somewhere in peaceful little Pensford walked someone whose past was worth killing to protect. Harold Sims arrived for his interview with the punctuality of a man accustomed to keeping appointments with authority, though his nervousness was evident in the way his mechanic's hands repeatedly sought the comfort of a greasy rag. Inspector Morrison had chosen to conduct this questioning in Sims's own garage, where the familiar surroundings might encourage honesty, and Miss Marple observed how the man's anxiety seemed to lessen once surrounded by his tools and machinery. Morrison began with routine inquiries about Sims's naval service, and the responses painted a picture of competent but unremarkable duty. He had indeed served as a petty officer in stores during the Mediterranean posting, and his discomfort when discussing the Commander Hartwell case was palpable. His testimony had concerned inventory discrepancies he had discovered and dutifully reported, never imagining the devastating consequences that would follow. "I was just doing my duty, sir," Sims said earnestly, his local accent thick with genuine distress. found shortages in the medical supplies, and when they pressed me about it, I had to tell what I knew. Never wanted harm to come to any officer, but the records didn't lie. Miss Marple found herself studying Sims's obvious anguish as he recounted those events. This was not the calculated response of someone concealing guilt, but rather the torment of a man who had unwittingly contributed to another's destruction. When Morrison pressed about Mrs. Hartwell's recent inquiries, Sims admitted she had approached him 3 weeks earlier, asking detailed questions about the supply shortages and his testimony. The crucial moment came when Morrison asked about his whereabouts on the evening of the murder. Sims's response initially seemed damaging. He admitted to being near the U Arch around the time Mrs. Hartwell would have passed through. However, his detailed account revealed something unexpected and significant. "I did see her near the arch," Sims continued, his weathered face troubled. "But she wasn't alone, Inspector. There was someone waiting in the shadows beyond the yew tree. Someone in a dark coat, standing very still like they'd been there a while." Morrison leaned forward with sharp interest. "Can you describe this person more specifically?" Sims frowned in concentration. "Medium height, I'd say, wearing one of those long coats that could belong to man or woman. But they moved like someone who knew the path well, even in darkness. When I approached with my bicycle, they stepped back deeper into the shadows, and Mrs. Hartwell seemed, well, not pleased to see them there." This revelation transformed the investigation's entire direction. Mrs. Hartwell had not encountered her killer by chance, but had apparently arranged to meet someone near the yew arch. The premeditated nature of this meeting suggested either confrontation or negotiation that had gone fatally wrong. The interview with Colonel Brent took place that afternoon in his study, a room that spoke eloquently of military precision and unwavering certainty. The colonel's bearing remained ramrod straight throughout the questioning, though Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain beneath his composed exterior. The room itself seemed to reflect his character, leather-bound volumes arranged with mathematical precision, campaign maps displaying past glories, and a silver-framed photograph of a young naval officer prominently displayed. The colonel readily acknowledged his nephew Geoffrey's role in the Hartwell investigation, describing it as thorough and professionally conducted. Geoffrey had built his case methodically, following evidence wherever it led, and the court-martial's verdict had been unanimous. When pressed about recent contact with Mrs. Hartwell, the colonel initially denied any significant interaction. However, Morrison's patient questioning gradually extracted a different story. Mrs. Hartwell had indeed approached Colonel Brent 2 weeks before her death, presenting herself as a researcher writing about naval justice during the war years. She had asked pointed questions about Geoffrey's investigation methods and whether he had ever expressed doubts about Commander Hartwell's guilt. "I found her inquiries inappropriate and told her so," the colonel admitted stiffly. "Military justice is not a subject for amateur investigation, and I suggested she direct her research elsewhere." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing of his responses and his unconscious habit of straightening papers when discussing uncomfortable topics. When Morrison asked about his whereabouts on the evening of the murder, the colonel's account seemed almost too precise, retiring early to his study to work on regimental history, remaining there until well past 11 o'clock. Yet something in his manner suggested concealment. Miss Marple observed how his hand trembled slightly when adjusting the photograph of Geoffrey, and she detected the faint, sweet scent of beeswax polish that seemed to permeate not just the room, but somehow cling to her own fingers from their earlier examination of Mrs. Hartwell's cottage. As they departed the colonel's residence, Miss Marple found herself reconsidering all the evidence in light of Sims's crucial testimony. The careful positioning of Mrs. Hartwell's body, the scattered jet beads, the missing documents, all now pointed to someone who had come prepared for violence but perhaps hoped to avoid it. The dark stain on her glove might represent contact with her killer's clothing rather than environmental contamination. The day's interviews had revealed a web of connections far more complex than initially apparent. Each suspect possessed compelling motives and opportunity, but the testimony about Mrs. Hartwell's mysterious companion suggested someone had arranged a final meeting, perhaps hoping to resolve the situation through persuasion rather than murder. As evening settled over Little Pensford, Miss Marple contemplated the psychology of someone driven to kill by fear of exposure. The careful staging of Mrs. Hartwell's death spoke to someone with intimate knowledge of both village geography and human nature, someone whose desperation had overcome their initial hopes for a peaceful resolution. The evening's questioning had left Inspector Morrison with more questions than answers, and he spent the night reviewing witness statements while Miss Marple contemplated the curious psychology of guilt that had begun to emerge from their interviews. The morning brought an unexpected development when a telegram arrived from London, addressed to Mrs. Hartwell at Pear Tree Cottage. The message, forwarded by the Postal Service, came from a private inquiry agent confirming that crucial evidence regarding Commander Hartwell's case had been located and would be dispatched by registered post. Morrison immediately contacted the London agency, learning that Mrs. Hartwell had engaged their services 3 months earlier to locate additional witnesses to her husband's court-martial. The agent's discovery was potentially explosive. A former naval clerk who had remained silent for 15 years was now prepared to testify that Commander Hartwell had actually been investigating the theft rather than perpetrating it. This witness possessed documentary evidence that could completely exonerate the dead commander while exposing the real culprits. The implications struck Morrison immediately. Mrs. Hartwell had been closer to achieving her goal than anyone realized, and someone in Little Pensford had compelling reason to prevent that evidence from reaching the Admiralty. The timing of her murder, just days before this breakthrough, could hardly be coincidental. Miss Marple accompanied Morrison on a second, more thorough examination of Pear Tree Cottage, where they discovered something that had escaped their initial search. The small alabaster dancer on the mantelpiece, which had seemed merely decorative, revealed its secret when Miss Marple noticed a hairline crack around its base. With gentle pressure, the base rotated to reveal a shallow cavity lined with faded velvet. The space was empty now, but the impression in the fabric suggested it had recently held folded papers or perhaps a small photograph. Mrs. Bell, who had accompanied them, examined the cavity with interest. How clever of her to hide things in plain sight. One wonders what was important enough to conceal so carefully. Morrison's systematic search of the cottage's remaining hiding places yielded another discovery, a torn fragment of heavy paper wedged behind the writing desk's drawer. The scrap bore part of a name written in precise handwriting, Burton, followed by what appeared to be a time notation. Miss Marple studied the fragment thoughtfully, noting the quality of the paper and the confident strokes of the pen. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Morrison decided to question Mr. Pemberton, the village's mild-mannered accordion player who had provided music for the harvest festival. Initially, this seemed a routine inquiry. Morrison was systematically interviewing everyone who had been present that evening. However, when presented with the paper fragment, Mr. Pemberton's reaction was startling in its intensity. His face drained of color, and his hands began to tremble as he examined the torn paper. I don't understand why you're showing me this," he stammered, though his obvious recognition of the writing contradicted his words. Morrison pressed gently. "Mr. Pemberton, we have reason to believe Mrs. Hartwell was not who she appeared to be. Her real name was Vivian Hartwell, widow of Commander James Hartwell, who was court-martialed 15 years ago for theft of naval funds." The effect of this revelation on Pemberton was immediate and devastating. He seemed to collapse inward, his usual quiet confidence evaporating entirely. After several moments of silence, he began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "I served with Commander Hartwell in the Mediterranean," he admitted. "I was Lieutenant Commander Arthur Pemberton then, responsible for supply coordination. The commander was investigating irregularities in the medical supplies when he died. There were those who said his death was convenient for certain people. Miss Marple observed Pemberton's confession with keen interest, noting the careful way he phrased his admissions. He was revealing enough to appear cooperative while avoiding direct acknowledgement of guilt. This was the behavior of someone with experience in navigating dangerous waters. Morrison leaned forward intently. "Are you saying Commander Hartwell was innocent of the charges?" Pemberton's silence stretched uncomfortably long before he nodded slowly. The evidence against him was manufactured. He had discovered discrepancies that certain officers couldn't afford to have exposed. When he died of fever, it seemed like divine intervention for those involved. The confession continued in painful increments. Pemberton admitted to meeting Mrs. Hartwell near the Yew Arch on the night of her death, having received a note requesting the meeting. She had confronted him with evidence of his involvement in framing her husband, threatening to expose the conspiracy unless he helped clear the commander's name. "I tried to reason with her," Pemberton said, his voice growing stronger as the truth emerged. "I explained that destroying several men's careers wouldn't bring her husband back, but she was determined, absolutely determined, to see justice done, regardless of the consequences." Morrison pressed for details about their final encounter. Pemberton described a heated argument during which Mrs. Hartwell had shown him copies of documents proving the conspiracy. She had given him until morning to decide whether to cooperate with her investigation or face exposure along with his co-conspirators. "I left her standing by the Yew Arch," Pemberton concluded. "She was alive when I walked away, I swear it. I heard her footsteps on the gravel path as I headed home through the village. Someone else must have silenced her after I left." This partial confession created more questions than it answered. If Pemberton was telling the truth, then Mrs. Hartwell's killer remained at large, someone who had either followed her from the meeting or had arranged a second encounter that night. The conspiracy Pemberton described involved multiple people, any of whom might have felt compelled to murder rather than face exposure. Miss Marple found herself considering the psychology of someone who would kill to protect a 15-year-old secret. The careful staging of Mrs. Hartwell's death suggested not just desperation, but a particular kind of calculating mind that could murder while maintaining the appearance of respectability. As evening settled over Little Pensford once again, the investigation had revealed the existence of a conspiracy that reached deeper into the village's past than anyone had imagined, while the identity of Mrs. Hartwell's actual killer remained frustratingly elusive. Pemberton's partial confession had unsettled the village more than any complete revelation might have done, for it suggested depths of conspiracy that no one wished to contemplate. Miss Marple spent a restless night considering the implications of his admission, and she was therefore already awake when the commotion began at the post office just after dawn. Miss Clegg's distressed cries drew half the village to witness the aftermath of what appeared to be a precisely executed burglary. The post office had been entered through the back scullery door without force, the lock turned by someone with intimate knowledge of the building's vulnerabilities. Nothing had been disturbed except for one item, a registered packet addressed to Mrs. Hartwell at Pear Tree Cottage, which, according to Miss Clegg's meticulous ledger, should have arrived that very morning. Inspector Morrison arrived within the hour, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene. The theft was clearly the work of someone desperate to prevent Mrs. Hartwell's evidence from reaching the authorities, but the method spoke of careful planning rather than panicked desperation. The intruder had known exactly what they sought and where to find it. Miss Marple observed the scene with particular attention to details others might overlook. The ledger lay open at the relevant entry, rather than closed and weighted as Miss Clegg habitually left it. A faint, greasy smear along the back counter caught the light with an unusual sheen that seemed neither oil nor ordinary dirt. Most intriguingly, a single black fiber clung to the scullery latch, no thicker than a hair, but clearly visible against the white painted wood. The question of access proved revealing. Miss Clegg possessed her key, the postman his regular one, but Morrison's inquiries uncovered the existence of an emergency duplicate held in Colonel Brent's dispatch box since wartime. The colonel produced this key with obvious mortification, explaining that he had not opened the box in years. Yet Miss Marple could not forget the sweet scent of beeswax polish that seemed to follow the colonel, nor the way his hands had trembled when adjusting his nephew's photograph. Dr. Haydock arrived to tend to Miss Clegg's distress, bringing salts and professional reassurance. Miss Marple watched him with the detached interest of long observation, noting that his gentleness seemed slightly theatrical and his cuffs bore the telltale sheen of recent contact with polished surfaces. When Morrison inquired about his whereabouts after midnight, the doctor's response, writing reports at home, one call to attend a child's cough, sounded plausible, yet somehow rehearsed. Harold Sims appeared drawn by the disruption, offering to repair the scullery latch with the awkward helpfulness of someone seeking to be useful. Miss Marple noticed that his rag left honest motor oil stains when it touched the counter, quite different from the mysterious smear she had observed earlier. The difference was subtle but significant. Oil possessed a dull tenacity, while the unknown substance carried a modest pride in its reflection. By noon, the violation had spread through Little Pensford like infection, and Morrison faced the delicate task of investigating prominent villagers without sufficient evidence for formal searches. Colonel Brent declined such examination on principle, a position Miss Marple respected while filing away as significant data. Dr. Haydock made elaborate show of accommodating the police in his surgery, his cooperation somehow too eager. Sims, with painful humility, turned out drawers containing nothing more dangerous than spare washers and invoices. The afternoon brought Pemberton to the vicarage with hat in hand, and the manner of someone abandoning pretense. His revised confession proved more damaging than his original account. He admitted taking one document from Mrs. Hartwell during their heated argument, not to conceal his own guilt, but to protect a third party whose marginal notations might destroy a life rebuilt since the war. He had resolved to return it while assisting in a cleaner exposure of the truth, but now any chance of restitution had been eliminated by theft. More disturbing was the small object he placed on the table, a narrow paper strip bearing 5 typewritten words. "Silence becomes you. Keep it." The message had appeared under his door that morning, slipped through in an unmarked envelope. The spacing and precision suggested practiced hands at a typewriter rather than letters assembled from newspapers, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of careful report writing, the sort that had characterized the Hartwell court-martial summaries. She examined the strip in window light, noting how the fresh ribbon had struck each letter with varying pressure. The E heavy, the O light, tiny mechanics that spoke of individual typing habits. The memory of a small Remington sitting polished on Colonel Brent's side table with a new ribbon box tucked beside it added another piece to her growing understanding. That evening, as Miss Marple prepared the tea service, she retrieved Mrs. Hartwell's glove for closer examination. The stained cuff glowed softly under lamplight rather than shining with oil's dull gleam. When touched with a knitting needle, it yielded with faint sweetness rather than petroleum's sullen resistance. The scent that rose from the mark reminded her unmistakably of Colonel Brent's study, though she also recalled that Dr. Haydock's leather bag showed signs of similar treatment. Polish meant to preserve rather than impress. She drew no premature conclusions, understanding that mysteries required patient cultivation like gardens. Instead, she planned her morning approach, seemingly aimless conversation about how stains never quite disappear from gloves, delivered in such a way that those with cause to flinch would reveal themselves while the innocent remained untroubled. As sleep claimed Little Pensford, Miss Marple reflected not on keys and ledgers and typewritten threats, though these provided useful evidence, but on pride's behavior when cornered in the peculiarly English habit of arranging destruction to resemble order. Miss Marple's morning began with what appeared to be a perfectly innocent social call upon Colonel. Brent, armed with nothing more dangerous than a small tin of furniture polish and the sort of gentle curiosity that had served her well throughout a lifetime of observing human nature. She found the colonel in his study, meticulously arranging his military memorabilia with the precision that had once commanded regiments and now provided comfort in retirement. The conversation meandered through pleasantries about the continuing investigation and the unfortunate disruption to village peace, but Miss Marple's attention was focused on the colonel's unconscious behaviors. When she remarked upon the excellence of his furniture care, noting the distinctive sweet scent of beeswax that permeated the room, she observed how his hand moved instinctively to smooth his jacket cuff, where a faint stain caught the morning light. "Such lovely old pieces require special attention," she murmured, examining a particularly fine escritoire. "I've always found that proper polish leaves such a distinctive mark. Not just the shine, but the scent that seems to cling to everything it touches. One's clothing, one's hands, even gloves if one isn't careful." The colonel's response was measured, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in his voice when he agreed that quality polish could indeed be persistent. More telling was his unconscious gesture of checking his cuffs, as though ensuring no telltale traces remained visible. The movement was brief but significant to someone trained in reading the small betrayals of guilt. Her next visit took her to Dr. Haydock's surgery, where she found him organizing medical supplies with his characteristic thoroughness. The conversation turned naturally to the challenges of maintaining professional standards, and Miss Marple commented thoughtfully on how certain substances seem to transfer so readily from one surface to another. "I've been puzzling over that poor woman's glove," she said with apparent innocence, "wondering how such a distinctive stain came to be there. The scent was quite pleasant, rather like furniture polish, though with a sweetness that suggests beeswax rather than commercial preparations." Dr. Haydock's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His movements became slightly more deliberate, and his eyes flickered briefly toward his medical bag, which showed signs of recent cleaning. When Miss Marple mentioned how such stains could transfer during physical contact, she observed the doctor's unconscious adjustment of his own cuffs and the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The contrast with Harold Sims proved illuminating. When she encountered him at the garage, his honest bewilderment at her questions about furniture polish and fabric stains provided a stark comparison to the careful responses she had received from the others. His rough hands bore the honest grime of mechanical work, and his straightforward manner revealed no hidden anxieties about transferred substances or incriminating evidence. "Can't say I know much about furniture polish, Miss Marple," he said with genuine puzzlement. "Motor oil, now that's different. Gets into everything and never comes out proper. But polish? That's more for the ladies and gentlemen with their fine things." This guileless response confirmed Miss Marple's growing certainty about the direction her investigation should take. The psychological patterns were becoming clear. Guilt revealed itself through unconscious protective gestures, while innocence remained comfortably unguarded. Returning to the vicarage for lunch, Miss Marple found Inspector Morrison reviewing the morning's developments. The attack on the London witness had been confirmed as serious, but not fatal, though the stolen documents represented a significant setback to their case. Morrison's frustration was evident as he contemplated the careful planning that had gone into silencing Mrs. Hartwell's investigation. "The coordination troubles me most," Morrison admitted. "Someone knew exactly when that registered packet would arrive, exactly what it contained, and exactly how to prevent it from reaching us. That suggests intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's correspondence and activities." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes reflecting the afternoon light streaming through the vicarage windows. "Indeed, Inspector. And I believe our morning's conversations have provided some insight into who might possess such knowledge. The beeswax polish that stained Mrs. Hartwell's glove is quite distinctive, a particular blend that requires special preparation and careful application." She described her observations of the morning's interviews, noting the subtle reactions and unconscious betrayals she had witnessed. The pattern pointed clearly towards someone with access to high-quality furniture polish, someone whose guilt manifested in protective gestures and careful deflections. The interesting thing about guilt, Miss Marple continued, is how it makes people reveal themselves through the very precautions they take to conceal their involvement. A truly innocent person would have no reason to check their cuffs or worry about transferred substances. Morrison listened intently as she outlined the psychological evidence that was accumulating alongside the physical clues. The combination painted a picture of someone desperately trying to protect a secret that had already begun to unravel through small telltale signs. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple reflected on the curious psychology of murder committed to protect reputation. The killer had acted not from passion, but from calculated desperation. Yet even the most careful planning could not account for the small human details that ultimately betrayed guilt. Somewhere in Little Pensford walked someone whose past was finally catching up with them, and whose next move would likely be driven by the growing certainty that exposure was inevitable. The peaceful village continued its daily routines, but beneath the surface, the pressure was building toward a confrontation that would finally reveal the truth about Mrs. Hartwell's death and the conspiracy that had made it necessary. The evening brought Inspector Morrison to the vicarage with news that transformed their understanding of the case entirely. The London witness had regained consciousness long enough to provide a crucial detail. His attacker had worn expensive kid gloves and carried the distinctive scent of beeswax polish. More significantly, the stolen documents had included not just Mrs. Hartwell's evidence, but correspondence from a private inquiry agent confirming that additional witnesses to the original naval conspiracy were prepared to come forward. Someone in Little Pensford was facing exposure on multiple fronts. Miss Marple listened to this development with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose theories were being confirmed by events. The pattern of desperation was becoming clear. Each attempt to silence Mrs. Hartwell's investigation had only created new evidence and new witnesses. The killer was trapped in an accelerating cycle of violence that would inevitably lead to their downfall. Morrison's next revelation proved even more significant. A thorough examination of the post office burglary had revealed fingerprints on the ledger that matched those found on the threatening note delivered to Pemberton. The same person who had stolen the registered packet had also attempted to intimidate the former naval officer into silence. This coordination suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both the investigation and the village's daily routines. The evening's most dramatic development came when Sergeant Reed arrived with urgent news from Pemberton's cottage. The former naval officer had been found unconscious in his sitting room, overcome by coal gas from a deliberately loosened connection. Beside him lay a typewritten confession to Mrs. Hartwell's murder, unsigned but clearly intended to resolve the case in a manner convenient for the real killer. Miss Marple accompanied Morrison to the scene, where they found Pemberton recovering under Dr. Haydock's care. His account of the evening's events was both terrifying and illuminating. A visitor in a dark coat had arrived just after sunset, presenting him with a confession and demanding his signature. When Pemberton refused, the visitor had produced a handkerchief soaked in chloroform, and his next memory was of waking to the smell of gas and the sound of Morrison's voice calling his name. The attempted murder bore all the hallmarks of careful planning. The gas connection had been loosened just enough to create a gradual buildup rather than immediate death, allowing time for the scene to be discovered and the unsigned confession to suggest suicide, driven by guilt. Only the killer's overconfidence in their chloroform dosage had saved Pemberton's life. Dr. Haydock's examination of the victim provided additional clues. The chloroform had been administered by someone with medical knowledge. The dosage was precise enough to render Pemberton unconscious without killing him immediately. More tellingly, traces of beeswax polish on Pemberton's collar suggested his attacker had worn recently polished leather gloves, the same type that would leave the distinctive marks they had found on Mrs. Hartwell's clothing. As the investigation team returned to the vicarage, Miss Marple reflected on the psychology of someone driven to such desperate measures. The attempted murder of Pemberton revealed a killer who was not merely protecting their own secrets, but actively eliminating anyone who might expose a conspiracy that reached deeper into the village's respectable facade than anyone had imagined. Morrison's systematic examination of the typewritten confession provided the final piece of evidence they needed. The document bore the same mechanical signature as the threatening note, the distinctive E that struck deep and the faint O that suggested a worn typeface. More significantly, the paper itself carried the watermark of expensive stationery, the type used for official correspondence rather than casual communication. The evening concluded with Morrison's decision to maintain surveillance on the 3 remaining suspects while Miss Marple prepared her final gambit. She had observed enough of human nature to know that killers driven to such extremes rarely stopped at one victim, and Pemberton's narrow escape had likely triggered a crisis of confidence in their carefully constructed plans. Colonel Brent's request for an urgent meeting the following morning suggested that the pressure was finally beginning to tell. His military bearing had shown cracks during their recent encounters, and Miss Marple suspected that his sense of honor was warring with his desperation to protect secrets that had already begun to unravel. Dr. Haydock's professional demeanor had similarly shown signs of strain, particularly when examining Pemberton's injuries. His medical knowledge made him capable of the precise violence that had characterized both attacks, while his access to chloroform and understanding of gas poisoning provided the technical expertise required for the evening's attempted murder. The investigation had reached its crucial phase, where the killer's desperation would likely drive them to one final, decisive action. Miss Marple spent the late evening preparing for what she sensed would be the ultimate confrontation, knowing that someone in peaceful little Pensford was facing the complete destruction of a life built on 15 years of carefully maintained us. As midnight approached, the village settled into an uneasy quiet that seemed to hold its breath before the storm. The widow who had danced alone at midnight was finally about to receive justice, though the price of that justice would forever change the community that had harbored her killer. Miss Marple understood that the next 24 hours would determine whether Mrs. Hartwell's death would be the last tragedy to touch Little Pensford, or merely the beginning of a reckoning that would expose the full extent of the corruption that had taken root in their midst. The truth was finally within reach, waiting only for the killer to make the fatal mistake that would complete the web of evidence closing around them. The morning brought Colonel Brent to the vicarage with the punctuality that had marked his entire military career, though Miss Marple immediately observed the subtle changes that spoke of a man under enormous strain. His dispatch case trembled slightly in his grip, and his usually immaculate bearing showed the first signs of collapse that she had been expecting since their conversation about furniture polish the previous day. Inspector Morrison had positioned himself discreetly in the vicarage study, where he could observe through the partially open door while Miss Marple conducted what appeared to be nothing more than a gentle social conversation. The arrangement would provide the psychological pressure she had found most effective in drawing truth from those burdened by guilt, while maintaining the illusion of casual village discourse. Miss Marple began her final gambit with the sort of innocent observation that had served her well throughout a lifetime of unraveling human mysteries. "Such encouraging news from London this morning, Colonel," she said, pouring tea with steady hands, while her pale blue eyes watched his reaction carefully. Inspector Morrison received word that Mrs. Hartwell's inquiry agent has recovered additional documents from a safety deposit box in Portsmouth. It seems the poor woman was even more thorough in her investigation than we realized. The effect on Colonel Brent was immediate and devastating. His teacup rattled against its saucer as his hands began to shake, and the carefully maintained composure that had carried him through 15 years of concealed guilt finally began to crack. Miss Marple continued her gentle assault, describing fictional evidence with a sort of precise detail that made her fabrication seem utterly convincing. "The most interesting discovery," she continued, was a collection of private correspondence between investigating officers during the original court-martial. Letters expressing doubts about Commander Hartwell's guilt, concerns about the reliability of certain evidence, even suggestions that the case was being rushed to protect other parties. The handwriting analysis should prove quite illuminating. Colonel Brent's remaining color drained entirely from his face. That cannot be possible, he whispered, though his voice carried the hollow ring of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. Jeffrey's investigation was thorough, absolutely thorough. There were no doubts expressed, no concerns about the evidence. Miss Marple set down her teacup and regarded him with the sort of gentle understanding that made confession seem less like betrayal than relief. "Oh, but Colonel, I believe there were indeed concerns. Just as there were concerns about the beeswax polish we found on Mrs. Hartwell's glove, and the typewriter marks that matched your Remington so precisely, and the emergency key that disappeared from your dispatch case on the night of the post office burglary." The accumulated weight of evidence, both real and imagined, finally shattered Colonel Brent's psychological defenses completely. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring at his gloved hands as though seeing them for the first time, before beginning to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "You must understand," he said, his military bearing crumbling as the words emerged. "Jeffrey was barely 25 when the Mediterranean posting began. Ambitious, yes, but fundamentally decent. He discovered irregularities in the medical supply procurement, but instead of reporting them immediately, he allowed himself to be drawn into investigating further. The confession that followed painted a picture of systematic corruption that had reached far deeper into the naval hierarchy than anyone had imagined. Jeffrey Brent had uncovered a network of officers and enlisted men who were systematically selling medical supplies to private merchants in Mediterranean ports, but his investigation had been compromised when he was offered a share of the profits in exchange for his silence. When Commander Hartwell began his own investigation, Colonel Brent continued, his voice growing stronger as the truth finally emerged, the conspirators needed a scapegoat quickly. Jeffrey provided one, manufacturing evidence and suppressing testimony that would have exposed the real thieves. The court-martial was a sham, designed to protect careers and reputations at the expense of an innocent man. Miss Marple listened with the patient attention of someone who had suspected this truth for some time, while Morrison took careful notes from his concealed position. The colonel's confession revealed not just the original conspiracy, but the desperate measures he had taken to protect his nephew's secret when Mrs. Hartwell had threatened to expose it. "Mrs. Hartwell approached me 3 weeks before her death," Colonel Brent admitted, his voice breaking with the weight of 15 years of concealed guilt. She had found Jeffrey's private correspondence about the case, letters he had written expressing his growing doubts about Commander Hartwell's guilt. She threatened to expose everything unless Jeffrey came forward voluntarily to clear the commander's name. The details of the murder followed the pattern Miss Marple had deduced through careful observation and psychological insight. Colonel Brent had arranged to meet Mrs. Hartwell near the Yew Arch, hoping to negotiate some compromise that would protect his nephew while satisfying her need for justice. When she proved inflexible in her demands, his desperation had driven him to violence. "I use my military training," he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting on a tactical maneuver. "Strangulation from behind, quick and silent, then the deliberate breaking of the neck to ensure death. I positioned her body to suggest an accidental fall beneath the treacherous yew roots, scattered her beads to support the deception, removed the documents she had brought to show me. The subsequent crimes had followed with inexorable logic. The post office burglary to steal additional evidence, the attack on Pemberton to silence his testimony, the attempted murder staged as suicide. Each action had been calculated to protect the secret that had already begun to unravel through small telltale signs that Miss Marple's experienced eye had detected and interpreted. As Morrison emerged from the study to make the formal arrest, Miss Marple reflected sadly on the tragedy of honor corrupted by misguided love. Colonel Brent had committed murder not from greed or malice, but from a desperate desire to protect his nephew from the consequences of youthful mistakes that had grown into a lifetime of lies. The irony, she observed quietly as the handcuffs clicked into place, is that Mrs. Hartwell sought only justice for her husband's memory. Had you simply allowed the truth to emerge, Geoffrey might have faced disgrace, but not destruction. Now both your lives are forfeit to protect a secret that was never truly safe. Colonel Brent straightened his shoulders one final time, reasserting the military bearing that had defined his life even as it crumbled around him. I regret only that an innocent woman had to die for my nephew's mistakes. Geoffrey was a good officer who made one terrible decision. I could not bear to see him destroyed by it. As the September afternoon faded into evening, little Pensford began the slow process of healing from the revelation that evil could wear the most respectable faces. Miss Marple remained in the empty vicarage parlor, her knitting needles clicking quietly as she reflected on the widow who had danced alone at midnight, finally receiving the justice that had cost so many lives to achieve. The truth, like the persistent scent of beeswax polish, had a way of clinging to everything it touched, leaving an undeniable trail that led inexorably to exposure and consequences. The peaceful village would never be quite the same, but perhaps that was as it should be. Some secrets were too dangerous to keep, and some prices too high to pay for the illusion of honor built on lies. The arrest of Colonel Brent brought an immediate transformation to the investigation's tempo, as Inspector Morrison's methodical nature asserted itself in the systematic collection of evidence that would support the prosecution's case. Within hours of the confession, a search team had descended upon the colonel's residence, where they discovered a treasure trove of incriminating material that confirmed every detail of his admission. The emergency key to the post office lay in his wartime dispatch box, exactly where Miss Marple had suspected, while his Remington typewriter bore the distinctive mechanical signature that matched both the threatening note to Pemberton and the forged suicide confession. Most damning of all was the brown paper parcel hidden behind his volume on the Battle of Balaclava, containing Mrs. Hartwell's stolen documents in their entirety. The inquiry agent's affidavits, the naval clerk's statement, and a sheaf of letters bearing Geoffrey Brent's signature provided irrefutable proof of the conspiracy that had destroyed Commander Hartwell 15 years earlier. Some pages showed scorch marks along their edges, evidence of the colonel's internal struggle between destruction and preservation of materials that might yet prove useful for negotiation. Miss Marple observed the search with the quiet attention she had brought to every aspect of this investigation, noting how the colonel's study reflected the same meticulous order that had characterized his military career and his approach to murder. Even in guilt, he had maintained the systematic habits that had served him throughout a lifetime of service, filing his crimes with the same precision he had once applied to regimental records. The village's reaction to these revelations unfolded with the particular mixture of shock and retrospective understanding that characterizes small communities confronting unthinkable truths about their neighbors. Dr. Haydock arrived at the vicarage that afternoon with the relieved manner of someone finally able to explain behavior that had seemed suspicious under scrutiny. His evasiveness during questioning, he revealed, had stemmed from professional ethics rather than personal guilt. Geoffrey Brent had consulted him years earlier about recurring nightmares and anxiety attacks related to his wartime service, seeking medical advice that the doctor had been bound to keep confidential even when it might have aided the investigation. Harold Sims appeared shortly afterward, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment at finding himself cleared of suspicion. His honest confusion about furniture polish and fabric stains had argued more persuasively for his innocence than any formal alibi, and Miss Marple took particular satisfaction in observing how truth had its own unmistakable accent that no amount of deception could successfully imitate. Pemberton's recovery from his brush with death proceeded slowly but steadily, aided by the knowledge that his survival had prevented a miscarriage of justice that would have compounded the original tragedy. His decision to cooperate fully with the Admiralty's forthcoming investigation represented a form of belated courage that Miss Marple found both touching and necessary for his psychological healing. The afternoon brought news from London that transformed the case from a single murder into a comprehensive examination of institutional failure. The Admiralty had acknowledged the gravity of Mrs. Hartwell's evidence and announced its intention to conduct a full review of the Mediterranean Command's activities during the relevant period. More significantly, a cable had arrived from Geoffrey Brent himself, transmitted from a merchant vessel in the Atlantic, announcing his intention to return immediately and place himself at the disposal of the authorities. This development struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, for it suggested that the younger Brent possessed reserves of honor that his uncle's desperate actions had sought to protect. The tragedy lay not in Geoffrey's original weakness. Ambitious young officers had succumbed to corruption throughout history, but in the compound interest that guilt had accumulated over 15 years of silence, ultimately demanding payment in innocent blood. As evening approached, Miss Marple requested one final visit to Pear Tree Cottage, where she wished to perform what she considered a necessary act of respect for Mrs. Hartwell's memory. The cottage stood empty now, its deliberate anonymity somehow more poignant in the knowledge of the passionate quest for justice it had sheltered. She gathered the scattered jet beads from the police evidence envelope and, with the patient skill of a lifetime's needlework, restrung them by the window where Mrs. Hartwell had sat planning her campaign against injustice. The small alabaster dancer remained on the mantelpiece, its secret cavity now exposed but somehow less significant than the courage it had represented. Mrs. Hartwell had hidden her evidence not from shame, but from necessity, understanding that premature revelation might destroy her only chance of achieving the vindication her husband deserved. Standing finally beneath the yew arch where the tragedy had reached its climax, Miss Marple reflected on the curious psychology of secrets and their ultimate futility. Colonel Brent had killed to protect a truth that was already emerging through multiple channels, his desperate actions serving only to accelerate the very exposure he had sought to prevent. The widow who had danced alone at midnight had achieved her goal, though at a cost that transformed victory into tragedy. As she prepared for her return to St. Mary Mead the following morning, Miss Marple contemplated the enduring lesson of little Pensford's ordeal. Evil might wear respectable faces and hide behind honored traditions, but it possessed neither the patience nor the subtlety required for permanent concealment. Truth, like the persistent scent of beeswax polish, had a way of clinging to everything it touched, leaving traces that the observant eye could detect and the patient mind could interpret. The peaceful village would heal, but it would never again enjoy the comfortable illusion that respectability and honor were synonymous, or that the past could be safely buried beneath the accumulated weight of years and silence. The days following Colonel Brent's arrest unfolded with the methodical precision that Inspector Morrison brought to all his cases, though the emotional aftermath proved far more complex than any legal proceeding could address. The Colonel's study yielded a complete archive of his crimes. The stolen documents, the emergency key, even the kid gloves bearing traces of beeswax polish and yew resin that had transferred to Mrs. Hartwell's clothing during their fatal encounter. Each piece of evidence confirmed what Miss Marple's patient observation had already revealed through the small betrayals of guilt that no amount of military discipline could entirely suppress. Geoffrey Brent's return from sea came with the dawn of the third day, his weathered face bearing the marks of 15 years' worth of sleepless nights and recurring nightmares. His immediate surrender to the authorities provided the final confirmation of his uncle's confession, but more importantly, it demonstrated the courage that Colonel Brent's misguided protection had sought to preserve. The younger man's detailed testimony to the Admiralty revealed the full scope of the Mediterranean supply conspiracy, implicating a network of officers whose corruption had cost lives while lining their own pockets with blood money. Dr. Haydock released from the ethical constraints that had made him appear evasive during questioning, spoke openly of Jeffrey's consultations years earlier. The young officer had sought treatment for what would now be recognized as severe trauma, his conscience tormented by participation in a conspiracy that had destroyed an innocent man. He was not evil, the doctor explained to Miss Marple as they walked past the surgery. He was weak at a crucial moment, then lacked the courage to correct his mistake until it was too late. His uncle's love became the very prison that prevented his redemption. Harold Sims returned to his garage with the quiet dignity of a man whose honesty had been vindicated, though he remained troubled by his unwitting role in Commander Hartwell's disgrace. His mechanical skills, which had once been turned to documenting supply shortages, now served the village's more innocent needs, and Miss Marple observed how he approached each repair with the careful attention of someone determined never again to participate, however inadvertently, in another's destruction. Arthur Pemberton's recovery proceeded slowly but steadily, aided by the knowledge that his survival had prevented a final injustice. His decision to testify fully before the Admiralty inquiry represented a form of belated courage that would help expose the conspiracy's full extent while providing some measure of redemption for his own years of silence. The village itself began the delicate process of healing, though the revelation that their most respected citizen had been capable of murder left permanent scars on the community's collective psyche. Mrs. Bell organized a proper funeral for Mrs. Hartwell, and little Pensford turned out in numbers that would have surprised the woman who had lived among them in such deliberate isolation. The service was simple but moving, with Miss Marple ensuring that the rest-rung jet beads rested upon the coffin as a symbol of the courage that had finally achieved justice for an innocent man. As September drew toward its close, Miss Marple prepared for her return to St. Mary Mead with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had helped restore balance to a world temporarily thrown into chaos. Her final morning in Little Pensford was spent beneath the yew arch where Mrs. Hartwell had died, reflecting on the curious psychology of guilt and the ways in which secrets, like poison, could contaminate everything they touched. Inspector Morrison arrived to escort her to the station, bringing news that the Admiralty's preliminary findings had already resulted in several arrests and the promise of a complete review of naval procurement procedures. Commander Hartwell's name would be formally cleared within the month, his service record amended to reflect the heroism of his investigation rather than the shame of manufactured guilt. She achieved what she set out to do, Morrison observed, referring to Mrs. Hartwell's long campaign for justice, though the cost was higher than anyone should have to pay. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes taking in the peaceful village scene one final time. The tragedy is not that she died for her cause, Inspector, but that she had to die at all. Had Geoffrey Brent found the courage to confess years ago, or had his uncle understood that true honor lies in facing consequences rather than avoiding them, none of this bloodshed would have been necessary. As the train carried her back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the widow who had danced alone at midnight, her final performance a waltz with justice itself. The woman who had lived in careful anonymity had achieved immortality through her courage, her name forever linked with the vindication of an innocent man and the exposure of a conspiracy that had corrupted the very institution meant to protect British lives. The peaceful village of Little Pensford would remember this September as the month when their illusions were shattered and their faith in human nature both tested and ultimately reaffirmed. Evil had worn a familiar face and spoken in reasonable tones, but truth had proven stronger than deception, and justice had prevailed despite the terrible price it had exacted from those who served it. Miss Marple settled back in her compartment with her knitting, the rhythmic clicking of her needles providing a gentle counterpoint to the train's steady progress toward home. Human nature, she reflected, remained eternally consistent in its capacity for both corruption and redemption, and somewhere in that consistency lay the hope that truth would always, eventually, find its way to the surface.